Hey, ladies, how are you doing? I am still running perpetually short on time, but I wanted to dive into this week's character. It's one that I've been really mulling over a lot, and I feel like it's one where wish there was more to the stories that we do have. Like, there seems like there's big gaps. I would love to hear some of the other people who were around at the same time or saw some of it to fill in. But be that as it may, I'm going to break down super quick summary and we're going to dive right into the life of Elisha. So last week we talked about Elijah. He had hit a point in his life where he felt really alone, really abandoned, and God revealed himself to him through a still small voice, not through the whirlwind, the fire, the earthquake. And he said, You're not alone. I have over 7,000 other prophets and people I've kept back for myself. And I also have someone very special to come alongside in your specific ministry. So you're supposed to go and anoint a young man named Elisha. So you have Elijah, who is the elder, and Elisha, who is a young man who God anointed to walk and be like his helper, but also kind of the one who would come after Elijah. So when we first meet Elisha, we meet him in 1 Kings 19, and that's just verses 19 through 22. So it's just a short little bit, and then it jumps back into the life of Elijah primarily. But when Elijah went down out of the mountain of the Lord and he meets Elisha, he anoints him and kind of lays it out to Elisha. This is, what God's called you to do. Will you follow me? And Elisha immediately is like, absolutely. And it says that he was plowing in the field. So he would have been a farmer. And what he did in following the Lord's call or responding to the Lord's call is it says he took his plow and his oxen and he broke up the plow, lit a fire, and sacrificed his oxen on it. So he literally took away and sacrificed his means of income, his means of earning money, his livelihood. He offered it as a sacrifice to the Lord, went and said goodbye to his parents, and he joined Elijah. I can't go back and forth like this. So I'm going to say it wrong a few times, but I'll correct myself. Elijah literally burned his plow and moved forward. And it is where we get the phrase like to burn a plow or to burn a bridge is a similar connotation where there's just like, there's no recourse, no going back. This is what he was called to do, and this is what he was going to do with his life. So the context as it moves forward where Elisha jumps back into the picture is at the end of Elijah's life. And Elijah asks Elisha, is there anything I can do for you before I go? God had made it really clear that Elijah's time was drawing to a close. And Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, which would mean he was asking for the Spirit of God, the same powerful revelation of the Word of God, the ability to act with miraculous things happening. He was asking for that same Holy Spirit of God to be on his life. And Elijah's like, that's tough. I don't know if I can do it. And apparently God must have whispered to him that it can, but Elisha has to see you when you go to heaven. So Elijah passes that on and quickly in succession travels to 3 different distinct points in Israel. And he ends up on the opposite side of the Jordan after having thrown out his cloak. The waters part, Elijah and Elisha pass through. And then shortly thereafter, a fiery chariot pulled by a horse that was flaming comes down from heaven and takes Elijah away. And Elisha's there the whole time. And as Elijah is lifted up into heaven, his cloak falls from his shoulders and falls down to the ground by Elisha. And Elisha picks up the cloak and puts it on. Now, in Elijah's lifetime, he's described in various places as hairy, but what we can't tell from the context of it is if he was just like a super hairy guy or if it meant, and it's thought more likely that it meant this one that I'm going to say is that he had like a cloak or like an outer robe made of animal hair. And it was a very common thing for prophets going forward. John the Baptist it says that he wore the skins of animals. So he was hairy by his garments, his clothes, and lived out in the wilderness. So Elisha picks up the mantle and he begins to go back across the Jordan River. And as he does so, he's like, well, God either did what I asked or he didn't. I saw Elijah go up to heaven. So he takes the cloak off his shoulders and he hits the Jordan River with it. And just like it did for Elijah, the water splits in two and he gets to cross over on dry ground. When he crosses over, he meets a group of prophets. And these prophets show up a few verses earlier and they keep saying, hey, do you know, like Elijah's on his way out? Your leader's almost gone. Like kind of like almost a little arrogant. I almost imagine like, we don't know if God's told you this, like you're just his helper, but you know, he's not here for very long, right? And so it's like, what will you do next? He's a big deal. You're just a follower. Maybe you haven't heard this. And Elisha's response to each of those inquiries is just like, hold your peace, like calm down, step back. And as he is coming back across the Jordan River, the prophets see the water part. And they're like, okay, we guess the Spirit of God is with you, but we don't know if we believe this business about Elijah going up to heaven in a chariot and not dying. So they send a bunch of prophets out to look for a body. They don't find one. And Elisha's like, yeah, this is what I told you. Then people come out to him from the city of Jericho and they're like, our water's really bad. It's killing people who drink it. Can you fix it? So Elisha does. He does what any good prophet does. He prays and he throws some stuff in the well and it's all better. So he's parted the Jordan, he's fixed the water. From there, he's heading out of Jericho to Bethel. And that was the first city in Elijah's 3 stops before he was taken up to heaven. So he's kind of retracing his predecessor's like final steps. And as he's leaving the city, a large group of youth or boys, the Bible says, came out and began to like hassle him and tease him. And it's really easy to like think that these are a couple of little kids like just coming out, but we know it's at least over 40. And the word that's used to describe them is the same word applied in the Bible for different ways for boys who are like in their late teens or 17, 18, like definitely men in that culture's time in like an age of accountability where they should have known not to like hassle a prophet or really any elder, anyone older than them, but they start yelling random things at him. And the Bible tells us very little. So it's like, you know, your leader was taken to heaven miraculously. Why weren't you taken? You're clearly not important enough to get taken. The Spirit of God isn't with you. And they start calling him bald. And I always was like, that's a kind of a weird thing for a group of like basically grown boys to be yelling to somebody. But again, when I went back and listened through several other teachers, especially if you go back to the original Hebrew, what they said is that the words that they're using weren't like baldy, like, oh, you don't have any hair and you're just a servant to a prophet. You're not a prophet. They were saying that he didn't have any headship. There was no covering. It's like we somewhere down the line in English, it was translated as like your hair covers you, but it meant more like in a sense of leadership. So these boys slash young men were coming out and really challenging the call of God on his life and challenging that the Spirit of God was with him and that he even knew what was going on. Like, you were left behind. Who are you? You're lame. And Elisha, without further ado, calls out 2 female bears and they maul 42 of the boys. It's super random and that's all we get told. So it's odd, but it shows his absolute conviction and the reverence he held for the Spirit of God and the purpose God had for his life. Has my week been interrupted 800 times? Yes. I have no idea how many different days it's going to take me to put this all together, but we're going to keep on talking through the life of Elisha. So we finished with the crazy story about Elisha calling out bears. The next story we find is Elisha prophesying to both the kings of Judah and Israel that there's going to be water in the desert, death to their enemies, really specific instructions of how and what they're supposed to do next. From there, and you're hitting about chapter 4, from Kings, he shifts, and it's a story about a widow whose husband was in the group of prophets that both Elijah and Elisha often traveled with or seemed to kind of stay with it for different periods of time. So she comes to Elisha. Her husband had died, and she had 2 sons, and they were going to be sold to pay her husband's debts, like sold as slaves. So she's asking him for help. And he tells her to go around and ask her neighbors for any empty jars and to collect as many as she can. And prior to him asking that, he asked her if she had anything of value. She's like, the only thing I have is a little jar of olive oil. So that was a little prelude to her going around and asking for all the jars. So he tells her to go inside and shut the door and then pour from her full jar into one of the empty jars and to continue doing that. So she does it. She goes in after sending her boys out, collects all the empty jars they can, shuts the door on everybody else. It's done in private, and she pours and pours and pours and pours until she's filled every single jar. When they get the last empty jar, her jar fills it up and then is full, but doesn't have any more coming out of it. And it's enough for her to sell and pay off her husband's debts and to have enough extra to sell and live off of for quite a while. Another woman we meet in that same chapter realizes that Elisha is in town a lot, but doesn't have a place to stay, doesn't have a home. So they built him a room on the roof of their house. Elisha is delighted, and he asks how he can thank her. And she says there's nothing that she needs, but she's childless. And so, recognizing this, he says that next year, this time, she's going to have a son. Sure enough, she does. A son is born, and a few years later, her son gets sick and dies. And it says that she shut the door so that nobody else realized her son died. And she went and sent a servant to go get Elisha. And her husband asked her if everything is okay. And she was like, yep, I just got to take care of some things. She didn't even mention that their son died. And so Elisha comes back and she says, look, I wouldn't have a son if it wasn't for you. And now he's dead. You can change this. So Elisha goes up and he prays and stretches himself over the boy, and the boy comes back to life. He sneezes 7 times and he's restored. And so Elisha takes him down to his mom, and it's like, here you go. And she's like, yep, knew you would do that. And then from there, Elisha goes up to a town called Gilgal, where there's a group of other prophet buddies. And you have like the kings, water in the desert, basic resurrection, and then he's going home for dinner, sort of. I have no idea if it's in the same timeline, but that's the way it reads. And they're all making soup, and somebody realizes they threw in something poisonous, and now there's death in the pot. And Elijah looks at it, and Elisha looks at it, and he prays, and then he throws in a handful of flour in the pot, and everything's good. Everybody has some, no one dies. In that same scenario, there's about 100 prophets in the group, maybe a little bit more, but it's like roughly 100. And somebody comes and brings Elisha a donation, and it says it's 20 wheat loaves, but they would have been more like rolls, so pretty little. Would be a lot for one person, but like it's not enough to feed the group or anything. And he's like, oh, well, take these rolls and share them with the group. And he's like, that's not going to work. And he's like, just do it. And so he obeys, and he starts to break the bread and pass it around. And there's more than enough with leftovers to feed all 100 men. Remind you of anything else we read of later on in the New Testament? Like, pay attention. There's a lot of little similarities to his life and some of the miracles that we read about in Jesus or some of the other apostles' lives. Next up, we have a Syrian general named Naaman. And Naaman is like number 2, the best in all the land at fighting for the king of Syria. But he has leprosy, which in those days typically made you an outcast, but he was such an exceptional general that he still had a place of prominence, but he was suffering from a terminal sickness. Leprosy would not go away. And so, Naaman happens to have a little servant who's a captive Israelite girl, and she's talking to Naaman's wife one day, and she's like, I wish Naaman could go visit the prophet because he could heal him from his leprosy. And so Naaman's told this from his wife, and so he tracks down Elisha. And when he gets to him, he goes through the king of Israel. Like, there's a whole big deal, but basically he finally tracks Elisha down, And Elisha sends his servant out and says, Naaman, you just need to go dip in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be healed. And Naaman is super offended that Elisha wouldn't come out and wouldn't say hi in person. But his servants are like, look, we traveled all this way. If he asks you to do something really hard, wouldn't you do it? Why don't you just like try it? Because you literally have nothing to lose. It's not that hard. And so Naaman finally does, and he dips down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, nothing. The 7th time though, he goes under and he comes on and says his skin was as new as a child's, like flawless. It was white with leprosy before, and it's completely healed and clean. Naaman is so thankful, and he says he's going to follow Yahweh from here on out, and he asks for forgiveness because he has to lead his king into the temple, and the king has to lean on him when he bows. He's like, but others I will never serve another. Like, this is my God, and what can I give you to show my thanks? And Elisha's like, nothing. Elisha's servant doesn't think that's a very good choice, though, and so as Naaman is leaving, his servant sneaks out basically and runs after him, was like, oh, well, we could use a few spare robes. And so Naaman's like delighted and gives him some. The servant takes it, and when he gets back, Elisha's like, my spirit was with you and I saw what you did, and this was not the time to receive gifts or take anything. And the servant looked down and he's covered in leprosy as his punishment. Kind of extreme, but most of Elisha's life is pretty extreme. Next, some of the other prophets that they were commonly with, the ones with death in the pod and the rolls, were wanting to build a house that they'd have their own space to like stay and teach and work out of, kind of. And so in the process of building this house, one of them loses his axe head, like for chopping wood. It falls off and it lands in the river. And back then, axe heads would have been very expensive, and they weren't something that were like easy to get. It was borrowed. So it's a big deal. And Elisha goes out and he throws a stick in the water, and his axe head miraculously floats to the surface. That's it. End of story, but still cool. Next, it circles back to a king. So we've done a whole bunch of other things. Now we circle back to the king of Syria, Naaman's master. The king is getting really frustrated because he feels like anytime he plans a move, the Israelite army always knows about it ahead of time. He's always like one step behind, no matter how secret he makes his plans. And so he thinks that maybe like he's got one of his advisors are a spy, or there's a mole or something. And his advisors are finally like, listen, none of us are spies. This is because God literally tells Elisha what's going on, and Elisha tells the king of Israel, and that's how the king always knows what we're up to. And the king of Syria is like, well, that's an easy fix. We're just going to go kill Elisha. So Elisha wakes up one morning, and the whole army is like surrounding his home. And his home is at like the foot of many mountains, like a mountain range. And his servant is like super freaked out. Like, there's not very many of them. There's literally an army out there. It looks pretty scary. And Elisha's like, don't worry. And the servant's like, this is something you should really worry about. And so Elisha prays for his servant to see what Elisha can. And the servant's eyes are opened to the spiritual realm, and he sees that there are multitudes of fiery chariots pulled by horses of fire and angels. And it says it's filling up the entire mountain range surrounding them. So they might have a little army around their home, but they're completely walled around by a heavenly army. And I've always loved this story, but it makes me wonder so hard, like, if Elisha could see like that all the time. Was this like just common for him to see into the spiritual realm, the provision, the protection, the closeness, and like literal wall that surrounded his life? He lived in such an extraordinary place of knowing and seeing and walking with the Spirit of God. In the midst of all this, the Syrians are suddenly struck blind, and Elisha leads them back to the Israelite army. And their eyes are open and they realize they're surrounded. And the Israelite king's, do we kill them? And Elisha's like, nope, we're going to feed them and send them back to their king. And they do that. So obviously from that, they are incredibly embarrassed, and they come to siege another big city. And everyone in that Israelite city is starving to the point of like eating other people. Like, it's pretty severe. And Elisha is called in to bring the word of the Lord. And he says, by the end of tomorrow, everyone's going to eat, and food's going to be so cheap that even beggars can buy it. And at this point, like, there's no food available, and people are eating like animal poop, and nobody can afford anything. And the captain, who's like in the courtroom of the king listening to this is like, yeah, right. Elisha says that there's going to be all this food, but you're going to be trampled and not be able to eat any of it. And that's exactly what happens. The next day, the Lord passes through the enemy camp and makes a bunch of big scary noises. And the enemy that is besieging the city gets really scared and they all run away. And the people in the town all go out and they get to collect all the food that the army's been living off of. And in the process of the people rushing out of the city to get the food, the captain who kind of mocked Elisha's words or was like, how is that going to happen, was trampled in the people's hurry to get their cheap and free food. Then it goes from kings and commanders back to the woman who had built Elisha a room on top of her house. And she's not coming this time to ask for anything, but Elisha is like, oh, I should stop by my room and bring a word of the Lord. And he says, listen, God's sending a famine and you and your family mean a lot to me. And I think that you should move to another country for the time being until the famine is going to be over. And she very much takes him at his word. And she and her family moved to the land of the Philistines, which kind of been like a next door country. And after 7 years' time, when the famine's over, she comes back to find that somebody else has like kind of taken over her house. So she goes to the king, and the king's like, whoa, this woman like blessed this mighty prophet, and she has a son, and he was raised from the dead, and she was warned to go away. And so he's like, listen, there is no way we can do anything to this woman. And so he commands that everything be restored on top of like bonus. So everything's returned to the woman. She is more than set up and able to reclaim all of her possessions. Then more crazy things with kings happen. King of Israel becomes really sick and he wants to know if he lives. So he sends his servant Hazael to go ask Elisha. And Elisha says, you're going to recover, but then you're going to die anyway. And he goes on to say that Hazael is going to be the one who kills the king and then do a bunch of really horrible things to Israel. And Hazael's embarrassed by this, but goes back and smothers the king and takes his place, just like Elisha said he would. To make it that much more evil or nefarious, he, it is revealed, is married to one of Ahab and Jezebel's daughters. So the same horrible king and queen who persecuted Elijah a lot, their daughter is connected with Hazael, the murdering king takeover servant. So Elisha sends another prophet to anoint the next king with instructions to flee as soon as it happens, that Ahab's family line is finally going to be dealt with. A king that's not related or attached to Ahab's family in any way is going to be put in power. And Jezebel, who's still alive, and sitting upstairs in a courtyard watching all this mayhem unfolding below, is like, I don't know, it says she put on makeup and was going to trying to lure whoever's coming in. Like, who knows what's going on with Jezebel? But at this point, she's still old and very just a bad lady all the way around. The next crown anointed king by the prophets, his name is Jehu, and he calls up for the servants to throw her down, and they do, and she breaks her neck on the cobblestones, and dogs eat her body, just like Elijah and Elisha had prophesied. So Elisha gets to see the fulfillment of the word of the Lord there. Ahab's line is completely wiped out, and we see a number of years pass by. Judah goes through several shifts of power and changes. And the very last time we encounter Elisha is as an old sick man. It says he was sick with the disease that brought about his death. So he's really at the end of his life. And Jehoash is king of Israel. And he comes in and he's expressing how sad he is that Elisha is dying. And Elisha has some words from the Lord for him. And he tells him to take his bows and arrows and to shoot an arrow out the window as far as he can. And that will represent victory that God's going to give him over Syria. And he does it. And then Elisha tells him to take the bundle of remaining arrows and to take the arrows and hit the ground with them. And Jehoash hits the ground 3 times and feels kind of silly and stops. And Elisha gets very angry. And he says, you could have hit the ground 5 or 6 or even more times and completely destroyed Syria. But now, since you were so like pathetic about that and felt silly and felt self-conscious, you're just going to beat Syria 3 times. And that's all. You're not going to defeat them entirely. So Elisha died. And the next year he's buried in it says like a Moabite pyre. So it would have been kind of like maybe like a cavern kind of that people could go in and lay other dead bodies. And a year later, they were burying some other people, and one of them was going to be in the same cavern or burial hole kind of that Elisha was buried in. And when they put the dead body in, it touched the now just bones of Elisha, and the man came back to life. And that is the end of Elisha, which is absolutely crazy and very interesting. Like I said at the beginning, just lots of gaps. There's a lot we don't know, but it is a life of incredible miracles, of like power, of spots where we don't get full stories or full pictures of it. We see that God sends his word and his blessing and his punishment to both kings and to ordinary people. Like Elisha was definitely not just a prophet to kings. There were so many almost like commonplace interactions he had in the midst of prophesying rises and falls and victories and ends to kings. We see the absolute conviction of Elisha about the power and the presence of God. We don't hear the same internal struggles or fears that Elijah wrestled with. There's no doubt that Elisha ever expresses about God abandoning him, about him being alone. In fact, we see him interact fairly often with other prophets and other believers, and even people who are supportive of him in his ministry, like the widow who built the room for him. Elisha had the benefit of watching God work through Elijah, and he was absolutely convinced God was able to do every crazy thing he said he would do. And while I don't know about wanting like my kids to be calling out bears to eat people who make fun of them, I do want my kids to walk with less fear and more certainty about who God is and what he does than I have in my own life. Like if I'm Elijah, I want my kids to be Elishas. And while there are so many spaces or gaps in the story, we definitely see Elisha take God at his word and stand resolutely on his authority. He lived a life of persistence and perseverance and purpose, and he took possession. He thoroughly took hold of what God had for him. What hit me most there was probably from the story of the widow with the sons who were going to be sold. And there was all the oil in the empty jars. It's in chapter 4 of Second Kings, and I was reading through it in my grandpa's Bible, and he had a few little notes, and I like they really made me think. So he had scribbled something in the little margins at the bottom of the story about the woman and her sons, and he said that there were 3 principles of Watchman Nee. My grandpa loved Watchman Nee. From a book about spiritual growth called The Spirit of Judgment. I haven't read it. It kind of makes me want to. But it said that the only condition that we need for spiritual growth is self-emptying. So just like the woman couldn't pour olive oil into a full jar, she needed empty jars. And he said the 2 reasons for lack of growth is not knowing yourself and not knowing God's riches. And I started thinking about that so many times, like my life is so incredibly full. There's not space for God to pour into my places of need. It's just like crammed. So I need to empty my own solutions, empty my own attempts or scramblings, or just sometimes even just like the busyness, like just make space. Recognize that I can't satisfy those places of lack in myself or my kids, and that like God is abundantly able to fill in and to pour into and meet those needs. So the 2 reasons for lack of growth is not knowing yourself and not knowing God's riches. In chapter 4, the woman has to bring empty vessels. So the first step to walking in spiritual growth is to come empty. Like recognize it and make a point of coming. Like, I have nothing left, or what more can I do? Like, you can't. Bring that to God. Step 2 is to shut the door, just like the woman brought in all the empty vessels with her sons and she shut the door on them. So to get alone before God in my emptiness, in my lack, in my need. And number 3, to know that he has that vast supply, that rich supply, that he can fill to brim every bit of emptiness that I bring to him. It's a story that I've already talked through with my kids, and we're going to revisit again tomorrow. and go back through some of the things that they've picked out since that time reading through it. Elisha absolutely lived a life filled with the Spirit of God. Okay? God made us, his children, to live filled up in his heart, is that we know his ability and desire to fill us. And so that is the aspect of God's character that is my takeaway from the life of Elisha, that he is rich in supply and his desire is to fill us till we overflow. So I hope that sits with you today. I hope that kind of marinates in your own heart. I hope that this challenges you to intentionally bring the emptiness before the Lord, because it's a place of great growth, and recognize that it's a place where your needs are met with a massive supply. I'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye.